Okay, we'll continue our book reading this morning. Advanced Selling Strategy by Brian Tracy. We're in chapter 10, Closing the Sales, the End Game of Selling. Last week we looked at 10 requirements, 10 closing requirements. These are the things you need to do first before you can make a customer or you can ask a customer to make a buying decision. One of the first requirements we looked at last week was want. You must make the customer want what you're selling. You must create a buying desire in the mind of that customer. And to do that, you have to clearly define what is in it for the customer, what the customer will benefit from using your product or your services. The second requirement we looked at is believe. You also have to make the customer believe in you, trust you, be able to convince this client or customer that your product is going to deliver what it promises. Then the fourth one, which was the last one we looked at last week, is use. Always try to verify and clarify if your product or service is what your customer and clients will be able to use. Are they the best candidates or are they the best prospect for the kind of product you have or kind of services that you have? So today on page 387, we'll be looking at the fifth requirement, which is afford. So the customer must be able to afford it. The customer must not only have the money, but must be willing to part with it. The customer must have sufficient funds to be able to buy the product without ending up strapped for cash. This is a double-edged advantage. By making sure the customer can afford it, the salesperson makes sure his company will be paid for the product or service once it is delivered. At the same time, the salesperson makes sure the customer will continue to be solvent even after having paid for the product. Sixth, the customer must completely understand the full nature and scope of the offer. The customer must be clear about what he is getting and why and how to use it. The customer must understand the obligations he is entering into and the ramifications and consequences of the purchase. The salesperson must patiently walk the customer through these steps to see that the customer absolutely knows what he or she is getting into with the purchase. One of the biggest obstacles to the closure of sales is fuzzy understanding. This occurs at the moment of decision when the customer realizes he's not quite sure about what it is he's buying or how he is going to use it properly. As a result, he may hesitate or delay. One of your responsibilities as a salesperson is to double check and be sure that the customer is clear about your offering. Seventh, the salesperson must be eager to make the sale. He must be positive and confident about the benefits that the prospect will enjoy and must be determined to help the prospect enjoy them. In many companies alone, we spend millions of dollars each year buying products and services from salespeople and outside company. It continually amazes us to see the number of salespeople who make the calls and go through the motion, but don't really seem to care whether they make the sales or not. And because they don't seem excited about our buying, we don't get excited either. We procrastinate on the buying decision and often we don't buy at all. 8. The salesperson must have sound closing skills. The only way you learn anything is by practicing over and over, and this includes closing skills. One of the best things you can do is to write out your closing agreement and questions on papers and then practice them in front of a mirror. You should try your closing technique with your children, your spouse. You should use them in your personal business life. If you remember that a closing technique is simply a way of helping a person to make a decision, you actually find it enjoyable and fun to practice different methods. With my children, at their bedtime, if I tell them to go to bed, they will argue and protest. But if I ask them, what time do you want to go to bed? 9 or 9:30? The alternative closing, they will immediately choose 9:30. When 9:30 comes, they will march off to bed like little soldiers. They were closed without even being aware of it. Ninth, the salesperson must be prepared to hear a no and continue selling. You must be willing to ask for the order and be put off, either with an objection or a delay to another time. Finally, the salesperson must be prepared to remain silent after asking the closing question. The very best salespeople are masters in the use of silence during the sales conversation. Not only are they extremely good at listening to the customer and absorbing what he is really saying, but they are skilled at remaining perfectly quiet after they have asked a key questions of any kind. The longer the silence goes on after you have asked a closing question, the more likely it is that the prospect will buy. But the person who speaks first usually loses. If you break the silence out of a nervousness, the customer will sense an opportunity to procrastinate on buying decision or come up with another objection that cannot be answered at this meeting. It takes tremendous discipline to sit quietly while the prospect mulls over your question, but it pays off in the end. The president of a large insurance company who had worked his way up from the ranks of insurance salesman sat through a complete presentation for several $100,000 computer system to automate their entire operation. At the end of the presentation, the computer salesman, who was an expert at his business, asked the closing question: "When would you like us to get started?" The president smiled at the salesman and sat back in his chair, never removing his gaze from his salesman's face. The salesman sat quietly, unmoved, and without saying a word. The two of them sat there, much to the discomfort of other people in the room, for fully 5 minutes, with neither one moving or speaking. At the end of the 5 minutes, the president looked at his watch, smiled, and said, "That's the best I've ever seen. You've got the business." It turned out that the president has briefed his staffs prior to the meeting and told them to remain silent after he had asked the closing question. He wanted to see how long this salesman could sit without wavering. His standard was 5 minutes. At the end of that period, he was ready to proceed. He knew he was dealing with a world-class salesman. Okay, this is where we'll stop for our reading this morning. The 10th closing requirement. We looked at the remaining requirements that a salesperson would need when he or she wants to close a sale. The 5th requirement we looked at is affordability. The customer must be able to afford whatever you're selling to him. He must not only have money. It's not only about having money. He must also be willing to be part of what you're selling. He must also be willing to get or purchase what you're selling to him at that time. Then the 6th one we looked at is understanding. So the customer must completely understand the full nature and scope of the offer. So the customer must be clear about what he is getting and why he is getting what he's getting, what he can use it for. He must understand that, okay, these are the ways you use it correctly and these are not the ways you use it correctly. Then the 7th one is that the salesperson must also be eager. So it's not mainly about the customers. The salesperson also have requirements that he or she must meet in terms of closing sales. So as a salesperson, he or she has to be eager to make sales. He has to be positive. He has to be confident. You have to talk about your benefits, talk about the features of your product and services, talk about what you enjoy, talk about how you determine to help the prospect enjoy your product and services. The eighth requirement is sound closing skills. So you have to have a sound closing skills. It gave us a story about, or rather, it told us a story of how he closes bedtime with his children. Then the ninth requirement is hear a no. So as a salesperson, you just have to be prepared to hear a no answer. You have to be ready to face rejections and objections when they do come up from your clients and customers. So that is just a brief summary of our reading today. Thank you.